Hello and welcome to Maiden, Mother, Matriarch. My guest today is Lyman Stone, Research Fellow at the Institute of Family Studies and Specialist in the Sociology of Fertility. This was a really fun conversation for me because it was real kind of inside baseball level, being very, very specific about the history of fertility and fertility issues today. And actually, Lyman has some really surprising things to say. I received a lot of new information during this conversation, which was, not what you would expect. A lot of actually the study of fertility comes up with some really surprising findings. It's not always, it can be very, very counterintuitive. So examples of what we spoke about today. We spoke about the role of urban design in encouraging people to have children, whether or not intensive parenting has actually become more common. It feels that way, but does the data actually bear that out? The true effects of the pill on fertility rates, definitely some surprising findings in there. How income and fertility are linked. The linkage is different for men and for women. And also, I think really the overwhelming message of the show was the importance of young men being given the opportunities to signal their suitability as husbands. How can they signal that? What signalling mechanisms are no longer available to them that once were? That's all in the extended version of the episode, which as ever can be found at louiseperry.substack.com, where you can also find the writing that I do on Substack, the bonus episodes I do with my husband, other extended episodes, the MMM chat community, more information on meetups that are happening, fan meetups, including matchmaking events. Loads of things happening at the Substack. And another plug, I know I say this every episode, but there's a new edition of the Case Against the Sexual Revolution coming out. It's a young adult edition. It's shorter. It's simpler. It doesn't have as much grim detail in it as the adult edition. I wrote it with the intention of it being a suitable book to give to young readers 15 to 17-ish, maybe a bit younger. If you know anyone who you think would appreciate reading it, please consider buying them a copy. Lyman, there is this idea which I have seen circulated online so many times, and which I think you're skeptical of, that modern parents spend much, much more time with their children than do, say, our grandparents' generation. And I've always, sometimes the way that this is expressed in the numbers sounds extremely implausible. Like mums in the 1950s are spending like 30 minutes with their children a day. So I'm exaggerating, but sometimes
no,
the
actually,
way
some of the studies
is really extreme.
Do show that. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I've always thought, I mean, maybe that's partly accounted for by the idea that children used to be kind of allowed to run wild in the streets and then called in for dinner, maybe. But you wrote a very interesting Substack piece, or maybe it was the Institute of Family Studies, actually. You wrote a very interesting piece, there we go, on one, why these numbers are not great, and two, what is actually going on? Like, why do modern parents feel like they are parenting more intensively? Are they actually doing so?
This was a classic case of me search, where I have small kids. My wife is a stay-at-home mom. There's always neighbor kids running through my house. And there's a lot of conversation about parenting in my house. Not just because I'm a demographer, but because we're just in that stage of life. I would just hear like all this stuff, like, intensive parenting, like, we have to do all these things. And then, I'm aware of the research on it. I'm aware that there's research saying that like time spent on kids is rising. And I just kind of accepted that at face value. But eventually I was like, okay, I want to do some work in that area. So I went and looked at the data and I realized that it was completely wrong. Because what's going on is you have two different ways to track time with kids. One is a parent says, like, we do these time use diaries. You give somebody essentially a sheet. They fill out each like 5 or 15 minutes or however far, like what they were doing in that time and some other details. And one way you measure time with kids is you just like ask, like, what were you doing at 4 p.m.? And somebody says, oh, I was doing childcare. Okay. So that's clearly with kids because it's childcare. Or like, oh, it was bath time for my kids. The other way that you do this is you don't ask, well, you do ask what someone's doing, but then after you ask what they're doing, you just ask, who was with you when you did that? Just who was with you? So if somebody says, oh, I was at the grocery store at 4 p.m. And then you say, who was with you? They go, oh yeah, my kid was with me in the little part of the cart that you put the kid in,
Mm.
which my children refuse to ride in. They want to ride in the main bucket of the grocery cart. These are two different ways of doing this. Now, that second approach, the with kids approach, is not available in every survey. It's like a more advanced module that we don't always have. But for the surveys we do have it in, we know a couple things. One, there's no correlation in the change over time between time spent with kids and time spent on kids. Okay. So like countries that had a huge rise in time spent like doing childcare often had like a decline in time spent with kids
Mm-hmm.
or an increase, or like there was just no relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, that there really hasn't been a whole lot of change in time spent with kids. So what's going on is that parents are changing how they think about their time with their kids.
Mm.
And they're spending less time living their life with their children with them, okay, and more time doing things about their kid. And in
Mm.
particular, doing school, like helping their kid with school, bathing their kid, feeding their kid. We do also see a decline in the amount of time they spend, that parents report spending playing with kids.
A decline.
Yeah. So we spend a lot more time doing the parts of parenting that suck. And we spend less time just like living our life in the presence of children or playing with our kids.
The thing you noted, which made me the most sad from this time use survey data, is that mums are spending less time with other mums
Mm-hmm.
plus kids.
Yep.
So fewer mum dates or fewer play dates
Yeah.
involving the mums.
Yeah, so this is one thing that I don't think anyone had looked at before. I just kind of thought, hey, let's look at this, is that when we ask like who is with you, people don't just tell us about their kids. They also tell us other people. So I figured, okay, let's do like how much time did you spend with kid and with adult non-family friend, right? And yeah, there's a huge decline. So first of all, like everybody's time with friends is just declining, like because we're all living sad, atomized, isolated lives because social media is destroying the world. Okay, so but aside from that, there's actually an even bigger decline for parents. Like, yeah, okay, parents in general spend less time with friends, but the difference between non-parents and parents is getting bigger over time. Parents are becoming even more isolated from their friends.
Mm.
And that's particularly true for moms. Like it is the death of the play date. Now, again, this is a case where like I was interested in this because I feel like my house always has a play date in it happening. Like there's just always other people's kids around and other moms and other parents. But I'd heard from a lot of friends, they were like, how do you make that happen? Like, what do you do? And I was like, I don't know. You just open the door and people come in. But yeah, so my experience is very atypical, I guess. A lot of people very rarely have meaningful time with their kid and with friends. Now, the group that had actually had a little bit of an increase on this was dads.
Mm.
Dads actually became slightly more likely to bring their kid and hang out with a friend. So that I found that a very interesting, like, and again, it just, thinking about my own personal experience, this kind of checks out. Yeah, so it's a decline in parenting together, which it speaks to the whole stress of parenting, right? Like parenting is really hard when you have to do it alone. Parenting is really hard when you think of it as, what am I doing? I'm doing childcare. Parenting is not as hard. My wife swears that like the hardest days of parenting are the days where nothing is scheduled.
Agreed.
Because she's like, I would rather go to the grocery store or like go to like take them somewhere or go do something. But the day where there's just like at home, the kids will be terrible.
Yeah, true. Yeah. Yes, from bitter experience. I'm curious actually about how it is you have so many play dates, because I completely agree that it's basically the best bit of having kids is hanging out with your friends who also have kids.
Yep.
And just speaking from my personal experience, we don't do that as much as I would like or we would all like, because we don't really have, we've never lived in one place long enough to have developed that many local friends. And older friends that we have who have kids often live further away, or they don't have kids, in which case you might, I have a kind of play date scheduled this week, and that a lovely old friend is coming over to hang out, but she doesn't have kids, so we'll just be hanging out with my kids.
Yeah.
How is it that you have like back-to-back play dates? What's your secret?
So, like this morning at 8 a.m. while we were having breakfast, another mom dropped off her child, her 6-year-old, because they were out of school. And she needed to do something, her childcare fell through. So one way is my wife has just kind of made it clear, like, I'm here. If your normal childcare falls through, like I'm here and my kids are easier when they have playmates. So
Mm-hmm.
one is my wife has really cultivated the idea that she really believes that our kids are easier when they have playmates around.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are a lot of families that have at one point or another dropped their kids off at our house.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're dropping your kids off at the house, usually that means that the kids become familiar with the place. The parents then have another time in the future where they think, oh, my kids want to go somewhere. They want to play with a friend. Where could I take them today? Maybe we'll see if the Stones are free. We'll see if we can go by there. So this is the technical term is alloparenting, which basically
Mm-hmm.
means watching other people's kids for free. Giving alloparental care creates relationships of trust and friendships between kids, and it creates the circumstances for playdates. Secondly, our church is pretty forthright about organizing stuff. So there's a scheduled, all the moms get together, not all the moms who are able to, or get together once a week for anywhere from 2 to 6 hours for a play date, like at a library or a zoo or whatever. That creates relationships. Oftentimes it's just at someone's house. So we make a point of trying to have it at our house. Then beyond that, we blackmailed some friends into moving down the street. We moved home. So like when we lived in Montreal away from family, like there were a lot fewer play dates. Now, we still my wife just kind of stalked all the people with small kids in a couple blocks and just kind of eventually befriended them. And then they
I've been doing
discovered
this. I've been looking at houses that have little bikes outside.
Yeah. And you just you go on a walk with your kids and they're like, why did we walk by this block 6 times? We're waiting for them to come out of the door so we can bump into them. No, but really, you just kind of invest in whatever people are close, or you move yourself to be close to the people that you like.
How long have you lived where you live?
I mean, I was born 2 miles away.
Oh, okay.
In the hospital. So we just moved back a year ago, but we had lots of longstanding friends. Although most of the people that are dropping their kids here are not longstanding friends. They're people that we've known for a year, but they're people from our church.
Church is kind of the magic ingredient, right?
Yeah, it is kind of.
Yeah.
I sometimes say well, it doesn't have to be church, but it has to be a community where parents are at least semi-jokingly, but not totally spouse shopping for their kids. Okay. So there's kind of an evolutionary norm here that the reason people make alloparental investments in other kids, cross-culturally at a deeper level, is because they are potential kin, right? You invest in children that are either your kin or that are potential future kin, that is potential spouses for your kid, or at least they're the type of people that your kid might marry, right? That maybe your kid won't literally marry them, but they're the kind of kid that you hope your kid marries someday, right? The fundamental thing is you're looking for other parents who are like, wouldn't it be funny? Wouldn't it be fun if our kids got married? And you all laugh, and then you're like, but really, we would all be okay with that, right? You don't literally have to do arranged marriages, okay? I'm not endorsing arranged marriages per se, but you want the kind of community where everybody basically is investing in kin-like ties, and that is very difficult to do outside of religion because religion provides a compelling story for why you're literally kin.
Yeah, the school gates is pretty good. You do get to know local parents. How rural is your area? So I'm just prying into your life now.
That's fine. No, I live in a city,
who...
so I'm in I'm rated as a highly walkable neighborhood.
Okay.
Now I do have a third of an acre lot. I've got a big yard, but my neighborhood has apartments. It has condominiums. I'm in a single family home with a garage and a yard, but we can walk to our library. We can walk to a couple of restaurants. We could walk to a grocery store, but who walks to a grocery store? You have all the groceries to bring home. It's insane. Even if a grocery store is across the street, I'm going to drive. I'm in the top decile of density neighborhoods in the US. I'll say that. So it's pretty dense. Although 15 minutes down the road, my parents live on a 10-acre farm.
This brings us nicely actually onto this issue of density, which I know you've inserted that really beautifully there, because I know you've looked into this as well. How much does density impact fertility? It's a kind of a truism that obviously no one's going to want to have a baby if they live in an apartment, et cetera, et cetera. Is that true?
So it depends on what we mean by density. So, okay, what's your neighborhood like?
We're in suburban home counties.
Okay.
If that makes sense. So it's actually quite American suburban kind of energy.
Yeah. So you've probably got a driveway and maybe a garden. I guess you call it a garden in England.
A garden. We have a very small garden, yes.
What we mean by density can be quite complicated, because one thing we could mean by density is we can mean people per square mile. Okay? That'd be one measure. That measure turns out not to be that important for fertility on its own. And the reason is there's a lot of different ways to get a certain number of people per square mile. For example, you could
Australia has the
have
lowest in the world, for instance.
But so for example, you could have like a couple apartment buildings and then like a bunch of parks and parking lots between them.
Mm-hmm.
And that could be the same density as a bunch of single family homes on small lots.
Mm-hmm.
Or like or you can have mid-rise units. Like, there's a million different ways to get any given density. And so mere density turns out not, in the sense of people per square mile, is not that important. What is important is living space. So for example, in a neighborhood where there's more overcrowding, that is more adults per bedroom,
Mm-hmm.
fertility is going to be lower in general. If you have a situation where people have to live in like people who live in housing units with fewer bedrooms are going to have way fewer kids. People who live in group quarters, like dorms or prisons. There's other reasons people in group quarters might have low fertility rate, but even people who aren't incarcerated and live in group quarters have very low fertility rates. Like, you're bunking with, like, there's another person, there's just some rando there. Why are you going to have a baby? In general, the thing that matters most is basically like people per bedroom.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't have many bedrooms and if you have to double up adults, then you're very unlikely to have children, to have additional children. Now, in practice, high population density at the area level is correlated with lots of small units that have too many adults in them. So those are correlated. But when you control for both of them together, it turns out it's the bedrooms and the overcrowding that matters the most, and the general density effect matters less. So what that tells us is that, like, let's say that you're a country and you have a fixed amount of land because you are surrounded by water and you've had continuous human habitation for 15,000 years. So you're England. And let's say that you have rules protecting a lot of land, making it difficult to build in a lot of areas. So again, you are England.
Mm-hmm.
Nonetheless, it is the case that you can actually have quite different fertility on a fixed amount of density on a fixed amount of land, right? Because you might get the same density by building an apartment and then surrounding it with a park. But that's going to get you a lot fewer babies than a lot of single family houses with modest gardens. It's just, this is a more pronatal arrangement, is to have individual houses.
So interestingly, that is exactly what most urbanists dislike, right?
Yes.
The
yes,
the
they hate
suburb.
What I am saying is just like urbanists listening are just like, but
yes.
Okay, but not quite. Okay, so they do want to build up, and I don't really want to build up,
Mm-hmm.
but it's important to emphasize the small yard or small garden element, or even attached. So like attached homes, like townhome, we'd call them townhomes. You probably have some absurd Englishism for them.
Wait, semi-detached houses? Is that what you're talking about? Attached
Yeah,
on
like
one
when
side?
they're all attached to each.
Oh,
They're
we
single
call that
family homes.
We call that a
they're
terrace.
A terrace. Okay, terrace housing. There you go. These types of homes are fine. Like, you've got a little yard in the back, maybe no yard in the front, maybe a small yard in the front. There's no evidence that that type of housing is bad for family formation, because you can still get plenty of bedrooms in that.
Mm-hmm.
You can have density, but you have to really think about how you do it. You don't just want to stack people in little units sky high, right? And the problem is a lot of urbanists jump straight to that solution, when in fact you can often get just as much density, and by the way, just as much greenery often, by doing townhouses or terrace houses, or even doing small single family detached home lots. So one of the real leverage points here is that there's a lot of communities around the US, and I'm sure it's similar for you all, where like if you want to build a new house, like you can only do it on like a third of an acre lot or bigger, or like a half acre lot or something.
Mm-hmm.
And the result is just really inefficient use of space, and also yards that frankly people don't want to maintain.
Yeah,
they're
that's
just
big.
too much to maintain. Yeah, it's quite big. And so zoning to say, look, you can build on 1/10 of an acre. We're going to let you do that. That's actually a really important area where you can free up a lot of supply, build a lot of housing, let out a lot of cost pressure, and have a lot of density, but still have single family houses that are quite large. Does density matter? Like, yes, but it depends on what kind.
And it might mean some aesthetic. I mean, I've long had this beef with urbanists, including dear
Yeah.
urbanist friends who might be listening, in that a lot of what is aesthetically pleasing, you often see drone shots of the suburbs presented as this horror scenario, like
But
identical
it's a great
suburban blocks.
life.
I know, right? I look at it and I'm like, great, amazing. I
Yeah,
have,
yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
have a
Yeah,
driveway.
yeah.
One of the things, for instance, which I feel instinctively is pronatal, but is very unpopular with a lot of urbanists, is cars.
Mhm.
Like you do reach a point where
Yeah.
you have a certain number of young children where you just really have to take them
Yeah.
in the car to do anything serious, and that means having a
Yeah.
driveway, and that means having all the car infrastructure. And I mean, obviously, what you want ideally, and which, to be fair, like we basically have where we are in the suburbs. It sounds like you basically have it where you are in the suburbs. Is a bit of both. You can walk to some things, you can
We
drive to
can
some
walk and chew
things.
gum.
You're right. You can have this
Yeah.
thing called pavements, right? Um, but cars are very often the target of so much of this
Yeah.
thinking because they're
Yep.
ugly and because the roads are
Yep.
big and obstructive and whatever. But is there any research backing up my instinct that families like cars?
Yeah, absolutely. There is. So for example, like one example of this is we know that when car seat regulations are stricter,
Mm,
people have fewer children, and
mm.
specifically, they have fewer children at the threshold where they would have to buy a new car because the car seat doesn't let them move a kid into like a front seat or something.
We're
Um,
at that point.
yeah, yeah,
We
exactly.
can't
No,
fit anymore. But the car seats are so big, so you can't
yeah,
fit
yeah,
anything in the middle. And then,
exactly. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So in like, there's a nice paper that actually shows that at that threshold, people pause having kids until like a kid ages out and like all this stuff.
Mm,
So yeah, I mean, cars are an essential part of going beyond like one or maybe two kids.
hmm.
That said, there are options of how we think about how to handle cars. So, for example, like I have a driveway where I can park a car. I also have a garage where I can park a car, two cars actually. We choose to only have one car. Now we can do that because I work from home. I have street parking in front of my house that is never used. To be honest, I should have less street parking. The city should not be spending the money on maintaining as much street parking in my neighborhood as they are because it's never used. Like literally, we're the only family on the block that ever has anybody parked in the street parking because we'll routinely have like 15 families over here for a play date. So like I appreciate it, but it's definitely socially wasteful. At the same time, like I definitely want a road going to my house. Like pedestrian only is not going to work. Interestingly enough, though, on the back side of the houses in my neighborhood, there is a pedestrian and biking only path. There's paths that wind through the neighborhood and connect to a central park in the neighborhood. So when
Nice.
my kids are older and I want to tell them, hey, go to the park, they can have a fully separated walking path where they're not going to get hit by a car. That's great.
Mm,
And you could do both. And it only takes a tiny bit of real estate. Also, it's just very pleasant. It really increases the amenity value of the neighborhood.
hmm.
We also have sidewalks. A lot of neighborhoods in the US no longer build sidewalks for pedestrians. They just build the road
Why?
and there's nothing else.
Are they just not obliged to?
It depends on the local zoning. It's
Yeah.
important to have pedestrian infrastructure.
Mm,
You don't have to trade off. Like you can build
yeah.
car infrastructure that mitigates risk to pedestrians. But yeah, I mean, families are going to need cars. Cars are awesome. They liberate humans from the shackles of distance.
Mm,
And I think urbanists who don't take that seriously, who act like cars are this like horrible tyranny, no, cars are amazing.
mm,
They mean I don't have to carry my groceries home.
mm,
At the same time, it is true that we underprice car infrastructure. It's not efficiently handled. I think the way to kind of shoot this gap is to say, look, if you're in a neighborhood where houses have driveways and or garages, you probably don't need to mandate any street parking. You could have some, but you don't need to put a minimum street parking. You don't waste public resources paving roads for a neighborhood where everybody has their own parking spot. Let the private homeowner foot the bill for his own parking. So yeah, cars matter. You're not going to have a modern society without them. And people are like, oh, once we have autonomous vehicles, but I just don't buy that we're going to go away from the private car, particularly for families for a variety of kind of thin market reasons. Like calling an Uber, like in my town, calling an Uber is really easy. It'll come pretty quickly. Calling an Uber big enough for my whole family is impossible.
we store quite a lot of stuff in our car as well. I mean,
Yeah,
that
yeah,
partly
it's
comes
storage.
from our,
Yeah,
our English houses
absolutely.
being too small.
Well, and especially with little kids, like, an autonomous vehicle. Okay, so I have to install car seats each time I call it. Like,
Indeed.
Like, that's
Yeah.
not happening.
Or if we, for instance, keep one of the buggies in the car
Yeah, exactly.
a
Yeah,
lot of
yeah,
the
yeah, yeah,
time.
yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
you've got the one you use in the neighborhood, and then you've got the one that folds up tiny into the car. So,
precisely.
yeah, I mean, cars are important. I do think that there are opportunities to make pedestrian friendly car infrastructure, and we often don't do that. So, for example, I would personally like a little bit more in the way of speed bumps in my neighborhood,
Hmm.
but like that's not hostile to people with a car. Like I just don't want people to run over my kids. Like I can like cars and also like child survival. We can do both.
The only places really where this isn't possible are super old places, either
Yeah.
old cities or like I don't know if you've ever been to Devon.
No, I haven't.
The Devonian laneways are famously perilous because they're designed for like horse and cart, and that you
Yeah,
basically have
yeah.
the width of one car, and it has a speed limit of 60 miles an hour, and you just have to like, you really cannot walk safely along those. But that's rare, right? If you're in, particularly if you're in America and you've got new suburbs with loads of space, you could just have all of the above. And the only objection really you could have to car infrastructure is cars being unsightly. There's no practical trade-off.
But also, even then, if you think cars are unsightly, just make sure that you build places with garages.
Yeah, and underground car parks.
you
Yeah.
you can just like no one ever sees my car in my neighborhood. It's in my little garage. There's ways to do this.
Mm.
It's unfortunate that you get this kind of battle over cars when, you know, single childless people mostly use cars. People with 6 kids mostly use cars. Everybody mostly uses cars. And this is actually true not just in America, but in Europe too. And
Mm.
it's not that I'm
Mm.
saying we have to make every single space everywhere designed for cars. When we lived in Montreal, I loved there are large chunks of Montreal that are like pedestrianized or even just seasonally pedestrianized. And I love that partly because it meant there was a place where I could go and just like let my kids run wild over like a lot of urban space and they weren't going to get hit by a car. And that was great. So it's not that I'm saying like what families need is for every single inch of the urban built infrastructure to be designed for cars. But yeah, you are going to need car space. Like you have to have parking that's close to things because I am not schlepping all my kids a half mile to get to, the YMCA for a swim class from the car. Like the parking
Mm.
place needs to be close to the place I'm going.
Mm. Mm. Also, because car parks are dangerous, so you also want to have for little kids.
Yeah.
So you want to have the mum and baby spots right next to where you're going. This touches on a bigger paradox, which I know we're both interested in, which is
Wait,
that
hold on. Do you all have mom and baby spots in the UK?
not always, sometimes,
Oh, I was gonna be like, I wish we had that. My church has that.
sometimes.
We mark a few spots for older people who have mobility issues, then a few for disabled, and then a few for families with small children. But almost nowhere in the US will mark spots
It's
for.
more common in Australia.
Mm,
My whole extended family are Australian, and my grandmother in particular is absolutely outraged if she can't park outside the actual shop that she wants to go to. I mean, the idea that you have to walk
yeah,
anywhere is outrageous, and in shade.
yeah.
So yeah, parking is really elite in Australia.
Shade is fascinating. If you want to change people's judgments of if a community is walkable, add shade. You don't have to
Interesting.
change anything else. If you just add shade, people will walk more. There will be more business at street level businesses. Like shade is a game changer. And I really think we do underinvest in shade.
Interesting. Surely depends on latitude.
Yeah. I guess I'm talking about places that have hot summers.
Hmm.
Now, Australia is also an interesting case. It's a nice hypothetical because you can imagine on the question of density, because like you can imagine Australia's got a lot of land. Like it has no shortage of land.
Mm-hmm.
But you can imagine if you just drop an apartment building with small apartments into like an otherwise undeveloped part of Australia, we would not expect that apartment unit to be filled with big families, even if
Mm.
it's cheap. Right? Like we just wouldn't expect that because we recognize that it's about unit size, not density per se. Even if the broader census tract is very low density or very
Mm-hmm.
high density or whatever, like it doesn't matter. It's not about density, right? It's about the actual built form.
Many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we really can't understand the world or ourselves without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to point you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the MMM podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM. And now onto the show. Although, of course, Australian fertility is not higher than British fertility.
No, it is not.
No. I mean, also, this gets me on to the big, the big question, which I'm sure is in many ways the central question of your working life, which is people, you look at these little houses around here, tiny workers' cottages, which are now pied-à-terres for childless couples, and people raise 10 children in these houses, right? And now it is kind of illegal to do that. I mean, in the sense that I don't know what the rule is in America, but here you can't have opposite sex siblings sharing a bedroom after the age of 10. So you do reach the point where it becomes like technically child abuse for you to have more than 2 children.
I don't think it's quite that severe for us, but yes, you can get child services cases revolving around this kind of thing.
Yeah, and similarly, like the car seats issue we mentioned, it is illegal not to have that kind of safety in the car for your children. So it's not just that modern people are like namby-pamby and they don't want to take, like they will actually be pursued by social services if they make decisions which were completely normal in the past, right? Nevertheless, it is clearly the case that modern people in the West kind of breed like pandas. Like, we'll only do it if it's absolutely perfect, and and your life's work is devoted towards nudging people in directions which will make them more keen to have children. But it is, the obvious answer, which I think carries a lot of water, is it's to do with the pill. It's the fact that our ancestors didn't really get to choose how many children they have, and we do, because we have reliable contraception, which means that we can be super precise about the timings of children. But there is also something else going on there, right? Like we just have much higher expectations. We are much more, I don't know. Why is it, do you think? Is it the pill, or is it something else that means that modern people just don't want to breed?
The technology to produce the birth control pill was not invented on the day the birth control pill was invented. Mm-hmm. It could have been done earlier. Could have been done a decade or 2 decades earlier. Mm-hmm. It happened when it did because it was in demand. And it was in demand because of the baby boom, because the baby boom led to a lot of women marrying very young, having children quite young, hitting their desired family size quite young. Mm-hmm. Again, marriage ages fell during the baby boom. Remember, people got married much younger. And then getting to age 29 and being like, I've hit my desired family size. I would like to stop. And then being like, I can't stop. How do I stop? Mm-hmm. Now, of course, there were birth control methods available, like condoms and stuff, but the pill was directly in women's control and could even be used somewhat clandestinely. Now, the reality, though, is that fertility mostly fell before the pill. Most fertility decline happened in industrialized countries, happened before widespread contraception was available. And most of the decline from like 6 kids to 2 or 3 can be explained just by changes in marital exposure. That is, if you just assume married people of a given age are always going to make babies at the same rate, and the only thing that shapes fertility is how many people of each age are married, if that's your assumption, and that's a wrong assumption, but let's just work with it, that model explains most of the decline from like 6 kids to 2 or 3. Mm-hmm. And the residual of that decline is mostly explained by changes in child mortality. Mm-hmm. That is, that people started to have fewer kids because fewer kids died. And so they didn't need to have as many. Intentional fertility control definitely existed 500 years ago in at least some societies. It definitely existed 2,000 years ago in some societies. Demographers debate how widespread it was, what methods people used. There are still some demographers who really resolutely believe that intentional fertility control never existed before modernity. They're wrong. But it is true that a lot of intentional fertility control occurred via changed timing and structure of marriage. People didn't want to have too many kids, so they married later. That said, what the pill has done is it has decoupled sex. So it essentially obliterated. I think you've written about this a lot. It totally obliterated norms on extramarital sex, because the real reason for those norms was that extramarital sex created all these like problematic family dynamics that societies didn't want to deal with. The pill made it so that at least some people could have sex outside of marriage without kids. Now, of course, once those norms eroded, it turned out there were still a lot of people who would accidentally have babies. So it didn't quite work, but it created a critical mass to erode those norms. And then the pill did make it easier for people to adopt family limitation. It didn't invent family limitation, but it did lower the cost. And so it made it so that family limitation could be adopted more rapidly in other countries. It can help explain the speed of change. I don't think it can explain the direction of change or the final ending point, to the extent there is an ending point of change. But I do think that the advent of the pill can tell us a lot about why fertility decline happened so quickly all around the world. I think that's mostly what it does, but I don't think it explains the overall decline, especially since surviving family size doesn't change that much after the pill. If you look around the world, a lot of countries, their fertility actually rises for a whole generation or two after the introduction of the pill, because of complicated dynamics around mortality and things like that. So the pill matters for change of the pace of social change, but I think not the direction. If child mortality had fallen as it did, and if the social forces undergirding like shifted marital timing stuff had changed as they did, I don't think that we would be living in a world of 6 kids per woman, even if we didn't have the pill.
To what extent do you think that low fertility becomes kind of a self-reproducing meme, in that when it's not normal to have lots of kids, people become particularly averse to doing so?
This is a really live area of research right now because of a couple of kind of descriptive facts we know. We know that if you ask a 15-year-old, how many kids do you want to have? The answer they give you is wildly predictive of what they're actually going to have when they're 45. We have long-term longitudinal cohort studies where we've done this. And we know that 15-year-old's answer, they might not mean it super seriously. They might not be thinking that much about it. But at the end of the day, the people who say they want 4 kids have way more kids than the people who say they want 2 kids. And the people who say they want 2 kids have way more kids than the people who say they want 0 or 1 or something. Some people overshoot, some people undershoot. Actually, more people undershoot than overshoot. But stated fertility preferences early in life are really, really predictive of future behaviors. And so we want to know where those come from. And there is extensive debate about where fertility preferences come from. We have good reason to believe they're not genetic. There are a lot of reasons we think that, but basically it's because we've done a bunch of like GWAS type studies of fertility related stuff, and none of the genes that seem to be related are things that closely relate to fertility, that we would think relate to fertility preferences. They don't seem to be mostly like, they're not genes we think would be mostly working in that part of the brain. We also know that fertility...
Sorry to interrupt. Everything is heritable a little
fertility
bit.
is among the least heritable traits we know of.
Fascinating.
So in classic kinship studies, it has like some of the lowest heritability of any trait, along with social and religious values, which is like the next least heritable trait. Sorry, I should say next least genetically heritable. It is heritable, but not via the genetic channel.
Sure.
And there's basic evolutionary reasons for this, right? Like if there were a gene that made somebody way fitter, like have more babies, like it would proliferate like really, really quickly.
Yeah.
Secondly, in the GWAS studies we find that the genes that are under active fertility selection are not the same across cultures, and they're not the same across cohorts. That is, like Estonians, there are genes that seem to be associated with higher fertility among Estonians, for example. They're not the same genes that are associated with higher fertility among Finns. And those are not the same genes that are associated with higher fertility among Brits versus Americans. There's a bunch of papers on this. The long and short of it is not genetics. So it's got to be something to do with culture, socialization, something like that. There's a lot of research on what it is. We know that parental fertility preferences are only predictive of child fertility outcomes. or they seem to be only predictive when the child remains in the religious tradition of the parent.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like religion is really a crucial vehicle for fertility preferences. I have unpublished work that's in the pipes right now. I can say with considerable confidence that at least in some societies, children do not get their fertility preferences directly from their parents. It is not the case that if your parent was the kind of person who wants 6 kids, that you want 6 kids. It just isn't so. It seems most likely that what's going on is basically structured peer influence.
Mm-hmm.
So you want the number of kids your peers want.
Mm-hmm.
And so if your peers happen to be selected from a group that provides reasons to want a lot of kids, you will probably want a lot of kids. And so parents influence child fertility desires mostly by structuring their like peer groups and their social environment, which also makes, I should also say this makes heritability studies really complicated because the mechanism by which parents would structure peer environment is going to show up as non-shared environment for children rather than shared. So if you're familiar with like a classic kinship study design, you've got the genetic effect, the additive genetic effect, the non-shared environment, and the shared environment component. And the shared environment is classically what we think of as like environmental, like quality of your home or something. But parental interventions that structure third-party peer socialization is likely to show up as non-shared environment, even though it's a parental influence. Oh, also, we know that the number of siblings you have does not cause you to have a different number of desired children. This we know quite well, that it really is not the case that if your parents have more kids, that will cause you to have a higher fertility preference. What this tells us is, on the one hand, yes, the meme can become self-reproducing. As peer groups become hegemonically low family desire, they will tend to like percolate out to like adjacent social connections. And if the low fertility preference norm emerges in a very clustered way, you can get a cascade effect through a social network. In practice, this isn't an issue. Fertility preferences are not declining very much. They're really hardly declining at all in high income countries. They are declining in low income countries, but we think that will probably peter out, and they'll probably stabilize somewhere between 2 and 3.5 kids as the typical desire. We just don't see a lot of change in fertility preferences in terms of stated number of children desired. So it's definitely possible that like low fertility could seed a process of like cascading low fertility preferences. In practice, like we really don't observe this in the real world for the most part. What we do observe is that when governments force people to have fewer children, that does lead to lower fertility preferences. But that's an
You mean
atypical
like the one child
circumstance.
policy,
Yeah, like one child.
not like car
Yeah,
seat policy,
yeah. No, like the one child would be
like
the
proper force.
paradigmatic
Yeah.
case of that.
South Korea, I suppose, might be. I mean, they've seen the most astonishing drop in fertility from like
Yeah, it's
TFR 6 or
extraordinary.
something.
Yeah.
Could that be an example of that, the cascading
Yeah, the
preferences?
problem in South Korea is that we have actually really good, really large sample, scientifically conducted surveys of fertility preferences,
Mm.
and we know that South Koreans on average want 2 to 2.5 kids,
Right.
and that's true even for single women. Young single South Korean women want, I think it's like 1.8 or 1.9 kids
Mm.
on average, which is way more than they're going to have. They're going to have like 0.6 or 0.7.
Yeah.
We also know that among South Koreans, these are highly predictive. South Korean women who desire 2 kids and who get married before age 25 tend to have 2 kids. It's just that South Koreans don't get married. They're not
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
marrying each other. The issue isn't that they don't want kids. The issue is that all the women think the men are rapists, and all the women and all the men think that the women are like, I don't know, insane, depressed weirdos or something. It's gender war preventing coupling. And this is actually like going back to my thing about like coupling changes explaining most decline. Like the vast majority of fertility decline is explained by changes in coupling, not
Mm.
about a change at the decision made by couples. Okay, like
Interesting.
conditional on age and conditional on prior fertility history, like couple level decisions really are not changing very much.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you think like a classical transitional country like India. I have a paper I just published something on Substack on this a week or two ago. India had a fertility of like 4 children per woman or something in 1990, and today it's like 2. It's fallen by half. And yet, even in that 30-year decline, half of that decline is, and also India is a country where marriage remains quite young and marriage remains nearly universal. Like by age 35, like 95% of people are married or something. And yet even so, even the modest decline in marriage we've seen in India can explain half of the fertility decline in India since 1990. A tiny bit of marriage decline can explain a whole freaking lot of fertility decline if the marriage decline is happening in key reproductive ages.
Bringing us back to the pill, do you not think that the pill can take us quite a long way towards explaining why people are delaying marriage? And therefore, that even if the pill isn't directly causing people to forgo having children, it is indirectly causing it by changing marriage norms.
So it is, yeah. So I mean, this is a more interesting dynamic than just people controlling their fertility per se.
Mm-hmm.
It's basically this oblique effect through relationships. The
Mm-hmm.
challenge with that is that these marriage declines that we see don't seem like super strongly correlated with contraceptive uptake. I could check that. I know in the US at least, when we look at fertility within and outside of marriage, the place where we've seen the biggest change is shotgun marriages, right? Within marriages, we see a huge decline in fertility in the first year of marriage, particularly the first 6 months of marriage.
Right,
Okay.
yeah, okay.
Because it used to be you get pregnant, so you get married. Now
Yeah,
you get pregnant and you have an abortion, or you don't get married. You just have a baby
yeah.
out of wedlock.
Maternity wedding dresses are very rare
Yeah.
now. Although I have a
Yeah.
friend who listens to the pod who did get married while pregnant. So if she's
Hey, that's
listening,
great. More power
shout
to her.
out, yeah. And she looked beautiful and extremely pregnant on her wedding day.
Yeah. Yeah. So I do think that there is, I think, yes, the broader change in sexual culture definitely matters. I also, and this is going to sound weird, but the pill definitely matters for sexual culture, but we also see that sexual culture has changed even in societies that don't use the pill very much, which is like why there's tons of non-marital childbearing in Africa when there wasn't so much, in there was still more in the colonial period than we saw in the West, but there wasn't as much as there is now. It's like even in societies that are like not doing a lot of contraception, we actually still see a big change in the extent to which marriage really gatekeeps sex.
Mm.
We can also see that a lot of societies, the decline in marriage is not related to a rise in non-marital sex. There's a lot of societies where just people aren't having as much sex, particularly in the last 20 years, which is the most relevant time span we're talking about. Because if we think about the decline from like 1875 until 1980, say, like the pill like kind of arrived well into the decline. Abortion arrives in that process as well. But like most of the decline is happening like between 1876 and like 1920. Like
Mm.
most Western fertility decline happens then. And then you get a big boom with the baby boom and then a decline after that. But in the last 20 years, which is kind of the area that I think is my preoccupation, like there hasn't been a big change in contraception. I mean, there's been some. There's been some method mix towards permanent contraception, which is more effective and is reducing unintended
The
births.
LARCs, the long-acting reversible contraceptions,
Yeah,
they've
yeah,
definitely
yeah.
driven down teenage pregnancy, haven't they?
Yes, they have. Yeah, but most of the decline in the last 20 years isn't because of teenage pregnancy.
Mm.
Or if it is teenage, it's like 19-year-olds. It's not like 15-year-olds.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
In the US, I mean, the age that's had the biggest decline in fertility in the US is I think 22-year-olds. And we see declines now. Now fertility is declining at all ages under 35 in the US. Yeah, I mean, declining teen births is definitely part of the story, but I think I did the calculation recently. And since 2007, it was like 14% of the decline could be explained by declining teen births or something.
Mm.
And interestingly enough, a lot of the decline in teen births is actually explained by a decline in teen marriage. So, which, maybe declining teen marriage is a good thing. I think there's a credible argument that we don't necessarily want 15-year-olds being married off. The pill does matter insofar as it's kind of changed sexual dynamics, which changes coupling dynamics, which changes marital dynamics. And I think there is something there. But I just don't think the timing quite matches up to be the main story,
Mm-hmm.
right? The pill didn't dramatically change in 2007, but fertility did.
This is why this is so endlessly fascinating, because it's so it it's not obvious, and the things that people
Yeah,
often posit as being the obvious things, oh, it's the house prices dummy, that you see that a million
yeah.
times. It's so much more complicated than that. Could it be that the pill kills the shotgun marriage, right? the pill makes premarital sex acceptable, which therefore delays the incentive for young people to get married and whatever. So you do see an initial shock. I mean, you do see, for instance, this massive decline in shotgun marriages immediately. And then you have the mimetic effect, which is slower and percolates out of particular groups. And, there's the urban, rural, whatever, like it's complicated, but it becomes normal to be a dink or a dual income. I'm sure you know what that means, but listeners, a dual income, no kids couple, it becomes normal to just have one and done.
Yeah, it could be that. The problem is that we actually know what marital fertility rates have been. That is, if you look at household married couples, so dinks are going to be married couples, it turns out the decline isn't mostly driven by married people having fewer kids.
Right.
It's mostly driven by people just not being married. It's not so much dinks. Dinks aren't the main driver, oddly enough. They're the one we think about, but most fertility decline is among low-income people. And it's because they're not marrying at all. And again, I think the pill is kind of part of that insofar as it shapes coupling dynamics. But I think that we also have to ask, why did the pill happen when it did? And it's because something else was already changing. It wasn't a random technology shock. The pill was basically invented over a dinner party. Some people who were already interested in birth limitation were getting dinner together, having a conversation. There was a scientist in the room. He said, I bet I can make something. And then he went and did it. It was quite literally, there was a demand. Somebody said, hey, could you do this? And he did it. Birth limitation was the cause of the pill, not just the other way around. There's a great book on this called Birth Control in American Modernity by Trent McNamara, which I highly recommend. What is the case is that in the last 20 years or so, there's been zero increase in the real earnings of men in their 20s. Now, this isn't to say, oh, it's the economy, stupid. When we say there's been no increase in earnings for men in their 20s, that's partly the economy. But there's also a cultural factor there, right? Like men in their 20s, I think many of us would think men in their 20s today might have behaviors that aren't quite as conducive to marriageability as men in their 20s in some other period. We could think about all kinds of behaviors of men in their 20s. They've never been like a high functional group, but I think many of us would argue they're like below their usual average today. And what's going on here is that cross-culturally, women select mates in a way that is biased by their ability to provide insurance goods. So whatever the major threat is in your society, you marry a man who provides an insurance product against it.
Could you just lay out, because this is a very interesting distinction that you make between the idea that men are providers and the idea that men are insurance?
Yeah, so we get this idea of men as providers. Like, oh, women want a man who can provide for them, who can provide them, in a subsistence society, provide them food. In a hunter-gatherer society, bring home meat. In a modern society, income. This turns out not to be true. Cross-culturally, women produce a very large share of household subsistence. In hunter-gatherer societies, they do the gathering side, which is actually a huge share of calories. In subsistence societies, women work on the farm. They have the same job as their husbands. Actually, not just even in market economies. In early market economies, women generally worked. If the husband had a shop, they worked in the shop. It's really only with like mass industrialization that we get incomes high enough to subsidize women not working. The idea of women not working, quote unquote, not working outside the home, of course, is a product of rising incomes. Now, women often had different work than men. I'm not saying, oh, there was never any gender. No, gender differences have been around forever. Men and women often had different jobs. But if you're in a society where like the terrible tail risk that can happen to you is like Tatar raiders arrive in your village, rape you, kidnap your children, and they're sold into slavery and forcibly converted to Islam. Like a man who has capacity for violence is an excellent insurance product. And you might value that more than his abilities as a farmer, because you, the woman, you can get potatoes. Like potatoes you can handle. Tatars from the Crimea you can't handle. If you're a hunter-gatherer where big game is becoming more scarce and protein is a big limiting factor, and that's the thing that's like seasonally not available and stuff like that, then like the man who can go on the long hunt is a good insurance product because protein is the high volatility source. The woman she can actually provide the calories. It's the protein, which is like the risk side of things. Men are a de-risking asset.
Mm-hmm.
Likewise, in a modern society, women can earn. Okay, women can earn money. And yet they still select for men with earning potential. Why do they do this when women can women can out-earn men in a lot of fields now? They certainly outperform in school. Why do women keep selecting for this? And the answer is because rational women know, and rational women have known this for all of human history, that they are likely to have periods of time where it's much harder for them to work and their needs rise. And this is basically pregnancy and childbirth, right? That you need more stuff and it's harder to work. Mm-hmm. And this is true cross-culturally everywhere. And so what women look for is not a man who necessarily provides for their daily needs. In fact, a lot of cultures, men don't provide for women's daily needs. What they're looking for is a man who provides insurance products. Insurance is sexy. Slogan for a new insurance company. And so basically men are insurers. They are gap fillers. They are a backstop. And by the way, there's always something to be insured against. So people say, well, government's eliminated the need for men as insurers. There's some truth to this, insofar as welfare states often specifically privilege single mothers. Mm-hmm. And it is true that when governments provide bigger benefits for single mothers than married mothers, that we see rises in non-marital parenting and we see declines in marriage. That's true. When governments provide benefits that are non-discriminatory by marital status, we do not see that effect. So it's really important to understand. But the reality is most welfare states favor single moms over married moms. So for a variety of reasons. But it is actually that favoritism causing the marriage issues, not just the general level of welfare. And we have a lot of studies that show that. But what is true is that, and the reason why general welfare doesn't have these big effects, whereas the single mom one does, is because if the man no longer needs to ensure your ability to feed your child because food stamps or minimum food guarantees or whatever do that, now the man is the backstop for your other risk, like low social status. Like there's always a risk. Humans always find something to be anxious about. Anxiety finds its own level. So you're looking for a man who's an insurer against the salient downside risk in your society, okay? Mm-hmm. And income tends to be a good proxy for that. But the problem is young men can't signal their quality as insurers, right? Because peak income comes late in life, right? Peak income used to come earlier in life. Now it comes later in life. Mm-hmm. And what women are comparing against is not their own income. Women are not comparing men to themselves. They're comparing men to their dads or to the father generation, to the men who they observed as providers. And if they had a crappy dad who didn't provide, they're comparing to the dads who did provide. When young men are falling further and further behind older men, which is what is happening across the entire world due to like skills bias technical change favoring human capital formation, the result is young men are unable to provide credible signals of mate quality. And so even if the young men are marriageable, they can't get married. Good guys can't get married because like the market is just not giving them the right ways to send signals. And this is why religious people are still able to marry young. Is because religions give men ways to send signals of marriageability.
Or indeed, I'm thinking of the couples that I know who got married relatively young and have indeed, further to your theory, ended up having children because they're married, and what else are you going to do?
What else are you going to do?
Yeah. Many of those relationships were formed at university when no one was earning any money, really, but going to an elite university is a really good signal of your future capacity to be an insurance provider. I mean, that's obviously not available to most people.
And this is interesting. So university-educated people are still getting married at the same rate, right? Because academics are actually a pretty good signal. Like the guy who's the top of the class is going to get a job.
Yeah.
Right. So like women can observe, like schools actually create like a kind of a useful filtering mechanism. So like high status people still get married. And it used to be that poor people had more kids and rich people had fewer, but that's flipped now. In most industrialized societies, there's little to no gradient in fertility by socioeconomic status. And in some high socioeconomic status, people are having more kids than low socioeconomic status. Now, again, you have to control for cultural stratification in this. If you have a large group of Pakistani immigrants that are just all having more kids regardless of social status, that's kind of a different thing. So within cultural groups, we're seeing the flip.
Can we pause on that a moment?
Yeah,
So the
yeah.
income thing is really interesting, because a lot of people assume that within a society, the poorer people have loads more kids.
And it's not true.
It's no longer true. Is that what you found?
So before industrialization, high status people had more kids. This has been true in every society we've ever studied.
Mostly because they survived more, right? Because infant mortality
part
was
of it was
high.
Survival, but also it's because they were able to marry younger.
Okay.
Right? High status. If you're the son of a king, everyone knows that you are a high marriage candidate. Okay. So aristocracy can signal their mate value very easily. Whereas poor people, not so much. So yeah, they lived longer, but also because the reality is in a lot of traditional societies, having children was an important part of wealth and social status. And so it's what elite people did. Then in some societies, there's also elite polygamy, of course. So when you're dealing with a polygynous society, so the gradient between male status and fertility is always upwards in pre-modern societies. And in polygynous societies, it's just a vertical line. You're just either you're an elite man with a gajillion wives or you vanish from the gene pool. So polygynous societies are a whole other thing. But polygynous societies die out because it's an inefficient way of arranging society and they have lower fertility on average. So there you go. In the 20th century, this breaks down. Some argue it begins in the 19th. There's some evidence this starts breaking down in the 19th century, but it really collapses in the mid-20th century. And in the 20th century, you do see a gradient where poorer people are having way more kids than richer people. And the reason is that richer people adopt low fertility norms earlier than poorer people, and richer people adopt later marriage because marriage ages are moving later. Richer people start to delay marriage before poorer people start to. So in your pre-modern society, rich people are better marriage candidates. But then in the 19th and especially into the 20th century, richer people start adopting a norm of delaying marriage that you just shouldn't get married until older in life, yada, yada. And they're early adopters of these things and of smaller family size. They're also early adopters of child survival. So their kids are surviving more, so they don't need to have as many. And the upshot is basically that their fertility falls. It takes a lot longer for poorer people's fertility to fall. But nowadays it is falling, and it's falling because poorer people just never get married. Marriage rates among low socioeconomic status people in the Western world are rock bottom low. And it's not that they're all cohabiting either. A lot of them aren't cohabiting either. Their rates of just not having a sexual partner in the last year are higher. What you basically get is that in modern, highly educated, industrialized societies over the last 20 years, we're starting to see the emergence of a positive fertility status gradient. And by the way, I think that if I were to say 1,000 years from now, what will the gradient be? I would guess the gradient between fertility and social status will be positive.
Because it would be a return to the norm.
Yeah, because this children are awesome and people who can afford to have them have them. The only reason that doesn't occur is if you have some kind of emergent cultural norm in the period of shift. Right? So in that shifting period, if the norm is emerging from the elite first and percolating downwards, then yeah, the elite will fall first and then the others will catch up. Now, there are exceptions. Among the Amish and among Haredi Jews in the US, ultra-Orthodox Jews, you do see a negative gradient between income and fertility, which is interesting because we think of those as pre-transitional societies, but they're not. We see that in the total fertility rate. It's not clear if that would show up in a completed fertility measure, which is kind of inside baseball on method. Yeah, so basically nowadays income has a ambiguous to slightly positive influence on fertility.
The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.